Hi everyone, welcome to today's tutorial, and today I will be covering the different kinds of blurs that Adobe Photoshop has to offer. So as you can see that I have already opened up this image as a reference, and I will be showing you the different kinds of blurs. Right, so if you go over here to your filter gallery, to this filter panel right here, you'll see this blur gallery right here. So I will be covering all these 5 types of blurs and showing you what these type of blurs do and how you can apply each blur in different kinds of images to enhance or blur a certain portion of your image. Right, so without further ado, let's start. So I'll be starting with this first one right here, which is called the field blur. Right, so as you can see, this one pin comes up here. Right, so with the help of this field blur, I can actually add I can actually add multiple pins like this. Okay, so then if I go over here to this current pin right here, you can see that there's one small blue dot in the middle, right? So I can increase or decrease the blur from here, as you can see, right? So even though like on this background, you can't see much, but if I increase the blur more, you will see that the background is starting to blur a lot as compared to the other background over here. Right, so similarly, for example, if I come over here, I can decrease the blur or increase the blur as well. So by adding these different kinds of points, you can adjust different blurs in different areas. So like for example, you can have a lot of blur over here and probably keep the blur amount to be little over here on this newspaper. For example, like on here on this tag, like, you can increase it or decrease it like that. So this is like again, one of the most useful blurs that we designers use in case if you want to have different strengths or different percentages of blurs in different areas of your image, right? So you can just play around with this and experiment and see which blur, like how much blur you want. So you can see that the more I increase it, the blur around this pin is increasing like this, or decrease it like that. So the effects over here, this light bokeh the light bokeh, and I'm sorry, I do not know how to pronounce these, but you can adjust these as well. Like, you can add highlights like this. See? So you notice that if this pin is activated, the highlights will only be added, which is around the pin right here. So for example, if this pin is activated and then if I decrease or increase the highlights, then it's going to be adjusted like that. Right? So you can also adjust the shadows from here, or probably add some kind of saturation if you see over here. And then you can just play around, and whichever one you think that it looks better, you can just go ahead and click on OK. Right, so I'm going to click on cancel as of now because this is just for the tutorial to show you how the field blur works. So that was the field blur. Now coming to the second blur, which is called the iris blur. Right, so this one right here, this is the iris blur. Right, so as you can see, what this does is that as soon as I open this one really big ellipse comes up. Right, so I'm gonna go ahead and also just decrease the size and make it into a really small circle for now. Right, like this, you can just make it, adjust the shape, and like that. I'm gonna make this into a really small, like a small circle like this preferably. And I'm just gonna move this circle on top of my flowers right here. Notice that except the flowers inside the circle, the entire background has blurred to a slight extent, right? That's because like the more pixels you add over here in the blur, the more the background is going to be blurred. I'm going to show you how. See, notice that even though like I have increased the blur in this iris blur right over here, the entire background gets blurred except for the areas shown inside the circle like that. So of course you can increase or decrease like the shape of your circle or ellipse like this, right? And then you can adjust the blur accordingly like that. So this will help you to bring out focus to a particular area, whereas the entire background then gets blurred, right? So this was the iris blur. Now coming to the third type of blur, which is called the tilt blur right here. So this tilt blur actually is more useful for blurring the background of a particular portrait or a landscape, right? But I'm going to show you anyway what this type of blur does. So do you see these two lines, these two straight lines, right? So the areas which is within these two straight lines is going to remain the same, whereas the areas above these dotted lines, above this dotted line and below this dotted line gets blurred. I'm going to show you how, like that. So you see the area which is like within these two straight lines, those areas are intact. No blur, the sharpness, the contrast, everything remains to be same, whereas the other background from here, from this above dotted lines and these below dotted lines, they all get blurred, right? So like that. So similarly, you can also play around with the effects over here as well, in case if you want to add any highlights, you want to add any saturation or shadows, etc. You can do that over here. Okay. So this was the tilt blur. Now I'm going to start with the fourth type of blur, which is called the path blur. So this is quite interesting, the path blur. Right, so what this path blur does is that it allows you to add a particular path like that, however you wanted it to be, like this, right? And I'm going to click on escape to get rid of my pen tool like this. Sorry, this pin right here. So notice carefully that as I had added these pins in this particular direction, the blur is also following this particular path, right? So then you can increase the speed like this, or probably decrease the speed as well, depending on how much speed, how much percentage you want to add, right? Similarly, you can also play around with the basic. This was in the basic blur. In this one, which says rear sync flash, as you can see that it gives an effect that the blur is happening to a lot faster speed, right? So again, it becomes a little bit more distorted that way, like that. So this was the path blur, right? And now coming to the last one, which is called the spin blur. So the spin blur is also a really interesting type of blur, right over here. Okay, so as you can see that this is kind of like the opposite of the iris blur, right? So in the iris blur, what used to happen was that the background which is outside your ellipse or your circle, that that background used to get blurred. Except over here in the spin blur, it's the opposite. As you can see that the area or the portion which is inside this circle gets blurred like this in a circle form. Right, so you can place this anywhere you want it to be. Like for example, I'll place it on this hand, and then of course I can increase or decrease the angle of the blur like this. And then of course you see this white square over here, I can just increase or decrease the size like this and add the type of blur I want, like that, like this. So you can move this around and see where you want this spin blur to be, like this, as you can see. I'm just going to keep it on the hand like that. And that's it. So this was the spin blur as well. So now that we have come to the end of our tutorial, I have covered all the 5 types of blurs which is inside this blur gallery. This one right here. So given I've talked briefly about all these 5 types of blurs and what the effects do with and the effects of all these 5 types of blurs. Right. So with a little practice, you can use these type of blurs to your images to either enhance it or make or manipulate it however you want it. And that's about it. So you can experiment as well and adjust the settings accordingly. So now that we've come to the end of our video, I hope you found this tutorial to be useful. And with a little practice, you'll soon become familiar with all the type of blurs as well. So thank you for watching and stay tuned for more.